Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Oi, governor! Or something like that. Very excited to talk to our guest today. I'm the solo host. My name is Han Solo. Sorry, Richard Littauer. Sometimes I just like to mix it up. And I'm joined today by actually technically a co-host that he hasn't been co-hosting for a very long time, Ben Nickolls. Ben, how you doing?
That's my bad. Sorry. Things happened. Life got in the way, etc., etc. I'm good, though.
Oh, the shame. Well, the shame to my name. And I felt down hard. How did it feel? Anyway, you're not Pumbaa. You're Ben. And also Andrew Nesbitt. Andrew, how are you doing?
Doing good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for asking. Very excited to be joined here by Timon and Pumbaa. I'm going to stop with that. I don't know why I'm doing Lion King now. I'm just really enjoying it. Andrew and Ben are joining me today to talk about ecosystems. If you haven't heard of ecosystems, well, A, they're all around you, but B, it's a totally awesome resource. You can go to Ecosyste.ms. Ecosystems is the whole word, but .ms is actually the, what is that, Montenegro?
Yeah, it's one of the most pronounceable domain names I could choose.
Yeah, makes sense. And Ecosystems is an entire database of open source stuff. Now, I am not a shiller for ecosystems. I can't explain it, which is why I have both of you on the podcast. You may also know Andrew Nesbitt and Ben Nickolls because they are a pair of hooligans who have been up to lots of stuff over the past 10 years. 24 pull requests, Box, which helps you sort your GitHub issues. Ben, of course, is the strategic director at Open Source Collective, and Andrew Nesbitt has a race car. It's pretty cool. You actually don't need to have a lot of money to have a race car, apparently. You could just go take your normal car out to the rink. It's pretty sweet. But let's talk about ecosystems today. So who among you would like to answer the question of what is ecosystems and why does it matter?
I can take this. Ecosystems is a collection of various data sets, enrichments, I guess you could call them, around open source projects. So the core data is around open source packages and open source software repositories. And then there's around 66 different package manager repositories supported, something like 11 million unique packages and 127 million versions of metadata stored in the packages service. I'm kind of blowing my mind. I've not looked at that number for a few weeks and it's going up very quickly. And then there's loads of extra data that is collected around everything related to those packages, primarily as a source of data in a nice normalized format that works across every different kind of software ecosystem, which then enables you to build all kinds of interesting things on top of it. It's primarily provided as a set of HTTP APIs, and people then can build more interesting tools to do investigations and highlight interesting or troublesome projects within one or multiple software ecosystems without having to write that code over and over and run into all of the pain that comes of trying to support various different software ecosystems.
To add over the top of that, so it's really a set of services and data for people who are working in kind of open source so that they don't have to solve the same problems that I'll say we, but really I mean Andrew, has solved. If you're an application developer and you want to build a tool, maybe highlight issues with open source projects, you want to build the next Dependabot or something like that, you could use it for that. Or if you're a researcher or a policymaker, all the data is open and all the services that we publish, you could use to inform, research project around open source health. I know that's a difficult term, but, let's just go with it for the moment. Or if you're a policymaker that's looking at, where's the kind of risk in open source or how do we support open source as a government? We've kind of built all of the services there, which is a very different approach to the last time we did this. This isn't the first time we've done it. Our previous project, libraries.io, was more kind of service first. The whole kind of thing behind libraries.io was that if we build a search engine for software, then perhaps we can have an impact because we can try and kind of narrow the funnel of open source a little bit and remove this problem of people creating more open source to solve the same problem that somebody else has solved simply because they can't really find it. Instead of doing something like that, we thought we'll just build the services and then people can build the next libraries.io really quickly and really easily. And that's the whole reason why we've done what we've done, really.
Okay, so pretend I'm an idiot. You have 10 million packages of software that you are actively maintaining, and they're all hosted on ecosystems.io. Why is that incorrect?
So we don't actually host the packages. We only keep a record of the metadata about those packages. So every time that a package gets published, we see that go out to each registry and we collect a load of data, the name, the description, the tags, the versions, individual versions that are published, and then all of the dependencies, the maintainers of those things. And then the rabbit hole is very deep. So we can then go and fetch the source code that's referenced. So it might say this package is on Codeberg or it might be on GitHub. And then we go and inspect the source code and we can see who has been a committer of that source code, who has opened issues and pull requests, what interesting files are in that source code. Does it have a citation.cff? Does it have a code meta.json file? And then what dependencies are in that repository as well? Has it got GitHub action files? And then continue down that rabbit hole. If you do that on mass, you end up going, oh, actually, we found every open source project that depends on this particular package, which gives you really interesting breakdowns of the various versions that people are using for a given package. Also, then if you connect that with vulnerability data, which we do, you're able to go, oh, we've actually found all of the projects that have a dependency on a package at a version that is known to have a vulnerability. So you end up with kind of something that is like the GitHub dependency graph, but for all of open source, not just stuff that's on GitHub, and for every different software ecosystem, kind of all rolled into one, but broken up as small services so that it's kind of at least slightly maintainable for a regular human.
There was a paper that came out in 2022 called The Penumbra of Open Source, which talked about how projects outside of centralized platforms live longer. As ecosystems found, there are actually a significant amount of open source projects that aren't on GitHub.
So I have gone, again, down those rabbit holes of going, okay, this package says its source code exists on this URL. That URL might not be github.com. Let me go and poke that URL, see, does it look like a GitLab instance? Does it look like a Codeberg? Does it look like a Git or the Bitbucket? Some people still use Bitbucket. And so far, I've found 1,890 public instances of these Git hosts that are referenced from a package somewhere. So they're not just kind of randomly scraping the internet, but intentionally following the breadcrumbs of someone has published a package to like a public registry, which then references another public Git host. It's a long tail, but you're looking at millions of repositories that are spread out in non-GitHub spaces. I mean, the biggest examples are all of the Linux distros. They generally don't use GitHub. They use their own places. They may fetch from upstreams that might be on GitHub, but lots of that is elsewhere as well. And often if you just look at GitHub stats, you miss some of the most critical and most used packages, especially in the system package manager world, because they just don't exist on GitHub. There might be some mirrors, but it's very hard to connect that back to the kind of the real usage of them.
That's really useful because it helps me understand that there's a reason why you're doing more than just building the GitHub dependency graph, right? You're building a massive metadata corpus that other people can use to find things out about open source at scale. Now, if you actually go to the website, you have these amazing tools that are listed right on the front page. So you have dependency parser, you have diff, you have license parser. SBOM is actually the one I'm going to focus on today. You have an SBOM parser, which can parse and convert between SBOM file formats. SBOM stands for Software Bills of Material. It's a corporate name for a package manifest. Hey, we need to know what sort of software is in our system. That seems really important to me because I think every single bank or security firm is going to want to know what their software is. Maybe every military is going to want to know what their software is. Is Ecosystems, as far as you know, the best aggregator of all this data?
As far as I know, any one ecosystem might have a deeper kind of single resource. So there's libs.rs for the Rust world, which is much kind of more closely aggregated, curated data about the Rust ecosystem. But I believe in terms of especially looking at the connections between open source projects, there's nothing else like Ecosystems at this scale. I mean, we have 21 billion dependencies in the dependency table, which is the links between packages and repositories. That table is a headache and a half, as you can imagine, from a database administrator point of view. but the value there of being able to see the real usage within all of open source is pretty powerful. And then we also have kind of good download numbers for lots of these packages, but we can fill in the gaps where we don't. It's kind of designed to collect usage metrics in various ways so that you can mash them all together and go, okay, well, regardless of what features this package registry has, we can try and work out which are the most critical packages within a registry. Just going to pause here to tee Ben up to talk about private and public usage data, because we mentioned that in our FOSDEM talk.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. The other thing that I was going to say just very quickly is that some people might look at the overall number of repositories that we track. So we track about 230 million repositories, and people who are familiar with it will probably know that GitHub has about 500 million individual repositories that it likes to include in its data. I think that's the last time I looked. Maybe it's 1 billion now, who knows? But we only kind of use the original source repositories in that particular figure. So we do have the data for forks. We just don't kind of claim them.
I kind of call them interesting forks. So if a fork has been referenced by a package that was published, then it will get indexed. If a fork has a significant amount of contributions that's happening with it, then it'll get indexed. But in general, if you were to just index the forks of every popular open source repository, suddenly you've got 10x the number of repos. Of course, a fork is really just a branch of the source repository. So it's not actually very interesting. So we don't just try and pump the numbers, trying to collect the stuff that is relevant and real, because scratching my own itch, I want the good quality data to be able to do research, not just to be able to go like, we've got the biggest numbers. Also, that would be even more database headaches for me.
So, Andrew, you and I worked on a paper together, which was really cool, on code of conduct with Sheree Zhao from Toronto, where you helped me get millions of code of conduct files from repositories. And that was dope, right? That's really cool. And when you say I like doing research, I imagine you actually have your site set a bit higher than that, because it's cool to produce papers and have a lot of data. But I feel like you and Ben both work on large ecosystem scale things. Now, I'm looking again at the website and I see experiments. You have open source technology here with Tobias Augsburger and the others. That's awesome. You have papers indexing, kind of like James Howison's papers. And you have awesome, tracking all the awesome lists. That's great. But then you have this other thing right above it called funds. Tell me about what funds is.
Yeah, so funds is a collaboration between Open Collective and Ecosystems to try and tackle sustainability in open source in a slightly different approach than has been tried before. So rather than just encouraging individuals to fund individual projects that they find and see are able to fund them easily, kind of like GitHub sponsors, we're taking the approach of saying, like, instead we should try and get kind of a collective group to fund the ecosystem as a whole, a particular ecosystem. This might be Django. It might be higher than that, kind of like the whole Ruby ecosystem. Kind of the idea behind it was companies and individuals, but mostly companies, pour money in the top, and then we have a number of different algorithms that basically go, okay, well, we will programmatically try to work out which are the most critical projects in this ecosystem and then funnel that money out to them, along with a load of kind of checks and various steps to try and ensure if a project doesn't want money, we're basically emailing them and saying, like, we'd like to give you some money, but if we can't, or if you don't want it or you can't take it, then you can say, please don't try and send me money anymore. And we won't, which for a lot of large companies, Amazon and Microsoft, that email will come into them and they'll press no, don't send me any money anymore. That's actually a really helpful signal to be like, we won't try and fund you as a large company that publishes open source projects. You end up with just the projects that individuals or small groups that are heavily used across that given software ecosystem. And then if they have a funding YAML file, we can automatically send that money that's been allocated to them straight through using the power of Open Collective as a platform. And if they don't have a funding YAML, and we can't find kind of a public way that they have declared, here's how you can sustain us, then we'll email them, be like, how can we sustain you? Encourage them to add a funding YAML file if they can. So we've had quite a few projects that have added funding YAML files since we launched this project. And if they don't do that, then we literally send them a Open Collective link to say, okay, we'll just pay you this money straight into your bank account. But because it all goes through Open Collective, it's also transparent and logged. So you can actually see that all of this money that went into this ecosystem has gone out to these places. So it's not hidden. It's easy to kind of track and visualize how much is moving around in those projects.
That was good. So I have a slightly different kind of take or run at it, which is kind of about the fact that we're not the first people to do this. There's been plenty of projects that look like this in the past. I mean, you go as far back as you want. You can even go back to a project called Back Your Stack. Which was, yeah, exactly. Right. So like, this isn't even the first time that Open Source Collective and Open Collective have been involved in this space. You've got Flossbank, ThanksDev, StackAid, tons of others. So the question is like, what are we doing differently? And there's two things that we're doing differently. Like, number one, we are sending money to the most used packages. Our talk at FOSDEM, which we will link in the show notes, went into this fact. It's not opinion, it is fact. We know that the funding that we can see being directed to open source today, which is something we can talk a little bit more about later, goes to popular packages. It doesn't go to the most kind of used components in open source. It doesn't go to the projects that are a little bit deeper down the stack than Vue.js, for example. And I know that others like ThanksDev and so on have ways of kind of distributing funds down a stack. But I think, for instance, ThanksDev goes 3 levels deep. Various other methods are used by others. But we take a different approach, which is that we use all of the data the ecosystems tracks to make the judgment on which packages are actually the most used in an ecosystem. So we're tracking, 230 million repos or nearly 11 million packages. We've got the download counts for most of those packages also. And if we don't, we can probably infer them from the actual usage that we see in open source, which is another part of the talk that we did in FOSDEM. So that's one thing we're doing. We're actually funding packages based on their actual use in open source, which has good correlation to actual use across all of open and proprietary software, because there's a really good correlation between download counts and the usage that we track in open source. And then the other thing that we do is we support the entire ecosystem. So we are encouraging projects when we reach out to them to say, hey, we would like to give you some money, to make a decision on their own terms about where and how they want to receive that money. And if they've already made a decision, we just send the money to that place. And we send as much of the money as we possibly can on a monthly basis. So we're trying to kind of support other platforms. A lot of the money that we send goes to GitHub sponsors, for instance. And we're also trying to kind of build up the space by encouraging projects that haven't really thought about funding or haven't made a decision yet about how they want to receive that money to have a think and to put their decisions into their funding.yaml file. And then we basically track the funding YAML file. That's how we manage our payouts and stuff. So I think we might be the first project that is genuinely trying to support the entire ecosystem, including what some people might call our competitors, through that, really.
So I would like a bit more clarity on that, because you say things like actual usage, but you're not using actual usage because you can't track actual usage because no one is sending a ping every single time anything is used. What you're tracking is downloads, right? Or maybe dependency graphs. And maybe a combination of the two. And that's cool. What I don't get is how this is fundamentally different from, say, thanks.dev, because they also have a thing where they're going down the tree and, trying to sponsor all the projects down the tree. I also don't understand how you email people about their funding.yamls files, because doesn't it take a lot of time to email people and see how they get back to you and have them respond and then sort through their emails? Those are my questions.
So there's like 3 things in there, right? So the first is it actual usage? Of course not. No. I mean, there's various things that you can do to try and get as close to usage as possible. And I think we're about as close as you can be without kind of reaching into every single organization in the world and asking them, hey, what software do you use? Which is an ocean that you're just never going to boil, right? So yeah, we use the data of all of the tracked kind of dependency graphs of the 230 million repositories that we're tracking, including the interesting forks, and the download counts as well. But yeah, I think anyone that says, hey, we should try and track the entirety of open source usage, which, without casting any shade, I think maybe the Linux Foundation kind of said in their mobilization strategy back in like 2021 or something, it's just going to be impossible to do. So then the second point was around ThanksDev. The last time I checked, and again, this is no shade on ThanksDev, I believe they only go down to the third level and their funding algorithm only incorporates three levels of dependency. So it doesn't go down the entire graph. And we don't go down the entire graph anyway. What we do is say, hey, here's a curated kind of fund of packages for a particular ecosystem, like Django, for instance, or even Vue. We do have Vue, but Vue.js, the kind of big, kind of massive project at the top, isn't actually, I think, the big, massive project at the top that's funded through Vue.js, because it depends on some technologies that are used across the entire JavaScript ecosystem. And those technologies are, as a result, if you think about usage, potentially more important, in so much as if they fail, then more software than just the users of Vue.js would fail. So that's that particular point. And then I think the third one, which is really interesting and is a big part of why this collaboration between ecosystems and open source collective exists, is how do you wrangle all of those projects and how do you contact them all and how do you kind of operationalize this entire process? And this is why we have a collaboration between open source collective and ecosystems, because open source collective at this point has created a really efficient system for being able to reach out to projects, to be able to ask whether they would like to accept some money, for that invitation to be accepted or rejected, and then to manage all of those kind of payments. So where we don't have a funding YAML, we use the publicly available email address for the lead maintainer or maintainers to contact them. And yes, that is a bit of a reach, but public information. And they have the opportunity in that first message to say, no, this is not for me, and we won't contact them ever again. That's one off, and we're kind of building that picture of projects that don't want to accept open source as well. And I think responsibly, we will open that up so that we don't encourage Spamageddon for the next platforms that maybe come after us and so on and so forth. We've built an operational kind of service that now moves about $25 million a year from and on behalf of and to open source maintainers within Open Source Collective. And we're basically, with ecosystems data and ecosystem funds, driving that operational process. So we get a lot of the efficiencies of Open Source Collective, we get all the data of ecosystems, and we kind of package that up into something that we built within a matter of weeks to kind of, provide our take on how to support the entire kind of specific ecosystem based on usage.
And I had to push fairly hard on some of the developers at Open Collective to get all of these pieces in place. I think I'm probably the first person to really use Open Collective in this much of a platform way, rather than just kind of going to Open Collective pages and donating to projects individually. We're actually using their GraphQL API pretty intensively to be able to work out which projects are already there, and then to be able to automatically send out the invitations for expenses. I mean, there's all kinds of internal Open Collective jargon that I'm not a big fan of, but I have thought through it to smooth that out so that other people don't need to kind of use that directly. And it works really well. Like, it's the whole thing basically runs automatically now. If you donate money to one of the funds, which you can do directly from the ecosystem funds page that goes into Open Collective, everything basically starts happening there. And you don't need to give any SBOMs. You don't need to give any permissions to your private code or to share which dependencies you're using. It just goes, okay, well, we have a pretty good picture of which are the most critical packages in this ecosystem, and we can rank them. Like Ben said before, you're never going to be able to measure direct usage, but what we have is a good measure of the kind of relative level of criticality for any project. So that's how that distribution algorithm works. If you were to sort the whole registry by the things that are most used, in theory, it's 80-20. It ends up being like 0.1% to 99.9% in terms of the real world usage across these things. And what's nice about this is you can then say, okay, we'll broadly fund the whole ecosystem that we care about, or multiple. And then we'll also go to those kind of weird, small edge case projects that we use that we don't think anyone else really uses. And we'll go and fund those directly through whichever platform they're happy to be funded with, using ThanksDev or using GitHub sponsors. You can do both. You don't have to choose. You can be like, we will put a good amount of money in to support the whole ecosystem, and for those key, small, unpopular projects, we can fund those too in whichever way that project wants to be funded.
So Back Your Stack was originally built with the idea of you can say, this is the stack I'm on, and I'm going to back all the dependencies in that little stack, right? So I'm a Django person. I'm going to try to fund all the things in Django that are on Open Source Collective. This sounds like a new iteration of that, which is slightly better. Or maybe I'm just forgetting what Back Your Stack was, because it seems like both of you are shaking your heads. Ben, how am I wrong?
No. So it's a good stab. And yeah, Back Your Stack was in fact a little bit more than support your dependencies. So the idea was, I think you could drop your Git repository and then it would scour the dependencies for that particular repository and try and match up which of those projects already had an account on Open Collective, which, as you can understand, this was made a number of years ago, was quite limited in terms of its scope at the time. It would still be limited in terms of its scope right now, let's be honest. A lot of projects are on things like GitHub sponsors, and that's why we're doing that slightly differently. But what we're asking people to do is to fund a curated kind of list of packages that we've put together, which is a little bit weird, right? So, you might naturally ask, why should I support this fund that you've put together rather than support my own dependencies? And I think actually there's some good reasons to do that. If I say the sales pitchy way, Emma Irwin, I think, wouldn't mind me saying that Microsoft spent 3 months, I think it was, using Ecosystems data to do an audit of all of the software within their OSPO that was kind of critical to the area that they were looking at. I don't think it was the entirety of Microsoft, but, let's go with it. And they spent a lot of time and a lot of energy putting together a list of packages that they thought were most critical to them. And what we want to do is basically turn that 3-month process into a 5-minute conversation with your CTO or VP of engineering so that you can say, hey, what technologies is this company broadly based on? And they can say, we use Python. We use Django quite a lot, which is, the use case for Sentry. And we kind of do the rest, right? So we've scoured all the repositories that, Ecosystems tracks. We've combined them using a system of kind of tags and kind of relationships between projects. And then we've got the usage data, both in terms of repositories and downloads, and packaged that all up into a fund at various levels of granularity. It's very different to say supporting the entirety of JavaScript that is supporting Vue.js. And that's Vue, the ecosystem, not Vue.js, specifically the project. So yeah, there's kind of good reason to do that, which is we're looking at the most used projects in those particular ecosystems, and the chance that your dependencies include those particular packages, components, however you want to characterize them, is exceedingly high. So yeah, the idea is that we turn that kind of conversation into a very simple kind of process. And we believe that we have really, really good kind of statistically provable overlap in most situations for you to trust us that we've put together a package of the right things.
You talk about talking to your VP of engineering. That sounds like a very Chad Whitaker thing to do. Chad Whitaker is a guest we've had on this podcast before. He came on recently, I think it was 247, to talk about the open source pledge, which is basically a demand that companies put their money where their maintainers are or something and sign up to say, hey, I'm going to support open source as a whole. Is that a right assumption that you're looking for that level of engagement?
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because conversation with Chad ahead of the launch of the OSS pledge is the reason why we built this thing. We got wind of the fact that that was something that Sentry and others were doing. And we thought immediately that this was a big issue because a lot of the focus is on how much to give and almost no focus on how to give. And we know that organizations have a problem, both in terms of how to allocate funding and how to get that funding to people. And we are trying to address both of those things. Yes, others are doing it. We're doing it our own way. We support the entire ecosystem. Thanks, Dev, etc. We all love you. Thank you very much. We built this as a direct kind of reaction to that. And we built it really quickly. I think the turnaround for the initial kind of MVP with Sentry was 4, maybe 6 weeks, which we can do because we built it on top of Ecosystems, which we built to do this.
Ecosystems on its front page has a stat saying 1.6 million developers. I couldn't find a developer's API that's been opened by the API, but that's probably fine because that sounds like a giant security risk and you all live in Europe. But if I look at Open Source Collective, at opencollective.com/open source. I see Sustain OSS, which you can all donate to, which is great. But I also see 2,638 other collectives. And it seems to me there's a couple of orders of magnitude between 2,630 collectives hosted by Open Source Collective and 1.6 million developers. So how are you going to scale this? How are you going to make sure that you get the other 1.5 million on the platform to get their money?
So that number comes from the number of unique maintainers in the packages service. So that is the kind of people that show up on your npmjs.com page that say, I can publish a new version of this thing, or there's a variety of ways that that number comes in, as you can imagine, depending on which ecosystem you look at. But going back to what I said before, the kind of top 1% of packages get used so much more than the very, very long tail of open source. I have not done it. I would like to do more spam analysis on packages, but I would guess that 50% now of NPM's packages are spam, just absolute garbage. So we include the maintainers who have published that spam because they're public and all that data gets hoovered up. But that doesn't mean that every package is as important as every other package and they all should be funded. Instead, you can have a humongous impact by funding that top 1%, and then the long tail. Most of this open source is absolutely zero restriction. There's no barrier to publishing anything. There's no barrier to publishing a package on a package manager with like the Golang proxy. There's not even a registration. You just request a repo through the Go proxy and it's suddenly like, oh, I'm a Go package now. So there's a lot of cruft that ends up showing up there. And it doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of these open source projects needs to be funded because they're not all critical infrastructure. There's kind of like 10 to 20,000 open source projects that are truly massive and truly critical. They may not be massive in terms of code. There may be projects that are actually really tiny, but they are used very heavily, which puts them into a position of the world expects these things to continue to work, to not be taken over and used for malicious purposes, or to be able to be responsive if there is a need by the community in one way or another. Definitely does not mean that there's like 1.7 million people that are able to be in that position.
And I was hoping that I was going to be one of those precious few. But cool. Okay, so this makes sense. Now we're running up on time. And so I guess my final theme is going to be, great, we have another way to fund open source. Why does it matter?
Well, I hope that we have kind of put across the fact, the funding that we can see in the world right now is provably going to the most popular packages and not the most used packages, which I think is kind of fundamental failure for a group of people, including Andrew and myself, that for the last 10 years have said we should sustain open source. And then that kind of gets to the other point, which is the other way in which I think we've kind of failed, which is that we don't have enough information to make collective decisions about which projects, communities, maintainers, however you want to characterize it, should receive more funding because we're all kind of working in silos. The point that I want to kind of make toward the end of this is that if this is successful and if we are successful and if the whole, all of the, as you might say, competing services are successful, we're still going to have a problem because we're all working in silos. We can't make a decision to fund Vue.js because we don't understand how much total funding Vue.js has. And that's a massive issue for us. And I think for everyone. At the moment, Ecosystems includes all of the funding data from Open Collective, which is about $52 million of funding for projects that are hosted by Open Source Collective, plus a few other smaller hosts as well. And it includes all of the data for GitHub sponsors who don't publish the actual amounts, but we have the sponsor counts and we could, infer something from there, although it's very difficult to do so. But that is a drop in the ocean, right? Like the NSF's POSE program has distributed hundreds of millions of dollars of funding to open source communities alone. And we do not have a good way of snaffling up all of that data, attributing it and being able to link it through to the projects that we're currently tracking. And no one does. Others have started to try, invest in open infrastructure, published a report, I think it was last year, called The State of Open Infrastructure. And that did a lot of heavy lifting to try and track. I think it was just under $500 million worth of funding that went to open infrastructure projects, which is not the same as open source, but relatively close in terms of the kinds of projects that they're tracking. But we and every other kind of funder in this space, platform in this space, and so on, are effectively working in a silo, and we need better kind of data, whether that comes from funding platforms, whether it comes from funders, whether it comes from open source projects themselves, in order to be able to understand what that picture looks like, so that collectively we can make better funding decisions. There's a couple of ways in which we could organize around that, right? There are standards for this. There's 360 giving, and there's the open data contracting standard, which I actually worked on years and years ago with the World Bank. And we're not saying that we should pick one, but I think we need to have a real conversation about that particular problem. And we're more than happy to kind of get involved in that and kind of support that conversation as much as we possibly can.
As I said before, if you have kind of 10, 20,000 really critical open source projects, that number suddenly is like, oh, actually, that doesn't seem completely kind of like unachievable to make those projects sustainable. And there's lots of different ways you could classify sustainable, but what I'm more interested in is the knock-on effects of having those projects be properly supported. So if a project is in a good state, you imagine your project is responsive to problems and issues. It's able to kind of take on and upgrade its dependencies of other projects in a reasonable period of time, keeping everything kind of moving and able to pick up the latest security patches when they apply. It gives them more ability to do security reviews of their projects, as well as actually just being able to improve, right? And you imagine if there are millions and millions of open source projects, then are probably millions of closed source projects, depending on these things as well. Improving those projects and then having them be automatically upgraded by Dependabot. It's like, wow, that just had a sweeping impact on the quality of the software that is running across a huge amount of software in the world. Is the biggest crowbar that I can imagine in terms of improving open source and closed source software quality, is to be like, oh, if we improve these 1% of most critical projects, then you will have a massive impact on the other side of that as people are using it to have a huge improvement across the board. Who doesn't want that? That feels like an achievable thing to me. It doesn't seem, the 230 million number seems completely unachievable, but that kind of 10,000, 20,000 seems like we should be able to make a big dent in the sustainability of those projects.
Yeah, I think so. And that might also be a good point to kind of sneak in our next project, which we're currently building, which is about being able to better attribute an ROI, for a kind of, want of a better word, to investments in open source. One of the things that we kind of notice at the moment is that a lot of open source support is being given, certainly from companies, on the basis of kind of indirect benefits, whether it's kind of marketing eyeballs, or maybe it's a more HR kind of recruitment and retention kind of program. And one of the things that we want to do is be able to demonstrate to people who are funding these projects that really the return is direct benefit, in that you can see more people showing up in a community. You can see them better able to respond to the pressures that are placed upon them. But maybe we'll have to come back and talk about that another day.
That sounds really exciting. Obviously, people can follow along at Ecosyste.ms. Is there anywhere else where people should be following along with this sort of stuff?
No, I think we've got a blog, so blog.ecosystems, with the MS that you say. Open Source Collective manages its updates through opencollective.com/open source/updates if you want to go there. And you'll probably see us in various places on the interwebs over the course of the next kind of 4-6 weeks. So hopefully you'll see us around.
Exciting. Listeners, do go check out the FOSDEM talk if you haven't yet. It's another way to listen. But then again, you just heard the story here, so I don't know if you need to. But thank you, Ben. Thank you, Andrew. You can find a lot of links. We've been trying to put all of them in the chat, and they will go into the show notes. You can find it at podcast.sustainoss.org. And now at the end of every show, we have Spotlight. Spotlight is where we highlight other people's projects, things, love, dog toys, whatever, that we think are amazing and just need a bit of light shed on them. So, Ben, what is your Spotlight today?
My spotlight is going to be Jellyfin, which is a project that's hosted by OFC. It's kind of media center, kind of streaming distribution application that I think you can run on a bunch of, I'm going to call them smaller embedded devices without mentioning any fruit-based manufacturers, as well as just running from your computer. And the reason why I'm mentioning them is that one of my colleagues was recently proposed to using a hack that involved a bodged version of Survivor Australia, I think it was, which is amazing. So Jackson and Grace, congratulations. And to Jellyfin, I would say that's an interesting use case for your product people.
Sweet. Andrew?
Mine is Zizmore, which is a static analyzer for GitHub Actions. It's been around for a few months, but it's really kind of hit its stride recently. And it basically just looks at your action YAML or workflows in your GitHub repo and finds every different possible security problem that might exist in it. And it finds some really weird kind of esoteric ones. I don't know if you've already spoken about this before on the podcast, but there's been a number of security vulnerabilities from GitHub Actions, which have had knock-on effects to like try and take over other projects recently. And some of the vulnerabilities that you find in there are not something that a human could look at the file and go, oh yeah, that looks fine. For example, you can have a GitHub action that references a commit and you think, oh, that's cool. Like they've pinned it to a commit. That commit might not actually exist on the main GitHub action that you have referenced, but instead on a fork. And because of the way that GitHub works in storing all its forks as branches, it's basically a dangling commit on the main repository. And GitHub Actions will just pick that up and use it. And it looked from a human point of view like, oh, this is fine. But actually, it was code that was running from a completely different repository that you would not know and would really struggle to find. And there are, I think there's kind of like 30 different kinds of checks in this library that you can run it in GitHub Actions to basically ensure that you're not committing insecure and like vulnerable GitHub Actions into your projects. Highly recommend you install that if you are maintaining GitHub Actions, or even if you're using GitHub Actions in your projects, just to make sure that you're not in a insecure state. It is a very cool project.
As someone who built his first GitHub action over the weekend, I should probably install that. Thank you, Andrew. My spotlight is based upon the thing that got me into coding in the first place, which is that I went to uni and I got given a style guide that was from the school, and it didn't make any sense to me, but I heard about this thing called LaTeX, and I figured I could automatically do all my references. And then I built my own BST language to match the uni spec, and that was a complete waste of my time. And the essay got like an F, but it looked nice. And I haven't really looked back since. LaTeX is awesome, and it's open source, and it's free, and it is the best, and I just really, really enjoy it, even when it's annoying and there's an HBox overfill. That's spelled LATEX. It's pronounced LaTeX, not latex. I'm allergic to latex, but not LaTeX. So very, very excited to be able to rep that one. I'm not sure if I have before. I've been using it a lot recently. Friends, it was really great to have you on. Friends who are at home, it was really great to have you listen. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, there are many things you can do. This podcast is one of the 2001 parts of the open source ecosystem. I know Andrew said there's 10, 20,000 projects, but we have to be in there somewhere, and you can donate to us by going to opencollective.com, which is cool because we've already talked about that. opencollective.com/SustainOSS. That'll keep this podcast going, which is not a certain future in the coming months. We are very low on funds. I know because I've said this for the last 6 months. I really need to improve my marketing strategy. Besides that, we also have a Mastodon and a Blue Sky and a LinkedIn where you can talk about this podcast and share it with your friends. You can also just email it to them. You can email me at richard@sustainoss.org or podcast@sustainoss.org for all the hosts. You can go to podcast.sustainoss.org to check out the show notes. You can go to our discourse as well on sustainoss.org to talk about this podcast if you like. And finally, you can hug a maintainer wherever they are found. Andrew, Ben, thank you so much for being on today. This was great. And best of luck on the new project. It sounds really, really dope. I leave this podcast feeling like, that might actually be a change. That's really cool. So good work. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Thank you.